In 2005, Buddy and I were in college, and we met a local promoter in Virginia who let us join his crew. My friend became the ring announcer, and I became a referee and security guard. So the first night we worked the show together, I was doing ringside security. He was the announcer. And the main event of the show was Robert Gibson versus beautiful Bobby Eaton. And they did a perfectly great match, as well as you could expect in 2005. But as we were breaking down the ring at the end of the night, the promoter came up to us and said, "Hey, after party, Bobby and Robert's hotel room. Here's the address." So my friend and I thought, oh man, this is it. We're going to go party like the Horsemen. This is our chance to have a crazy NWA style story to tell. So we finished packing things up, went to the hotel. There were a few people there. Robert Gibson was hanging out in the back doing whatever he does. And we were ready to party, ready to do whatever those guys did. And beautiful Bobby came up to us and said, "Hey guys, it's great to meet you. Thanks for coming out. Do you want to see my drawings?" And then he proceeded to have us sit down next to him on the bed in his hotel and showed us drawings that he had in his bag. There was concept art from the WCW Mayhem video game. There were drawings that he did, drawings that fans did for him and of him. And we just sat there talking to him, looking at his drawings and talking about his career, and had a perfectly pleasant experience. He could not have been a nicer guy.
Well, perfect timing for this call. May you rest in power, Bobby Eaton. I didn't know Bobby Eaton very well. I was only on a handful of shows with Bobby Eaton over the years. The one I specifically remember was for IWA Mid-South in southern Indiana, and just the little barn that Ian Rotten would run. And he would bring in southern wrestlers all the time, but just one show he brought in Bobby Eaton, and I believe it was the show that Tracy Smothers started a riot, which is only fitting, of course. But it was only one time during my tenure in IWA Mid-South, when we would go down there every Wednesday and Saturday for the most part, that Bobby Eaton did come in. Always nice, very kind. From the outpouring of every wrestling fan, it sounds like, and of course, he will definitely be missed. This was just such an innocent call, wasn't it? What a twist he took us for at the end there. Again, not knowing that much about Bobby Eaton. I like to think that I've been on shows with every wrestler, and I have been on a show with Bobby Eaton, but I don't know that much about him to know that he was that into drawing. So much so, he would pull you over and ask you if you'd like to see his art, like he was a 6th grader in kindergarten coming home from a special project. Such a sweet scenario and a memory for this caller. Did Bobby Eaton draw? Is there Bobby Eaton drawings on the internet? We'll have to check those out after I'm done with this, obviously. You hear the stories of these guys in the NWA, and I trained under Robert Gibson for a year at OVW, and I heard some stories then. And even then, at that time, I believe he was partying like those NWA boys did party. Robert Gibson at the time was like in his mid-50s, pulling up to OVW training in his Cadillac because he said, that's what the boys buy. You buy a Cadillac, you take it on the road. That's what you do. Still living that life for sure. And this caller definitely wanted to live that life. But he got a little more taste of the new school wrestlers playing video games than he did the old school wrestlers snorting their weight in drugs. Good for you, Bobby Eaton. You set a precedent on that night and acted like one of the good guys, as you should have.
Back in 2015, there was 6 of us that traveled from Maine down to outside Boston for the Boston Pro Wrestling Marathon, a 3-day wrestling extravaganza that was built for months and promised to just be, again, a marathon of pro wrestling. It was a very interesting event. We get to the venue, the roof, I could practically touch the roof, and I'm only 5'10". Not the best of attendance the first day. The biggest Saturday night 50-50 raffle was won by somebody that worked for the promotion, quote fingers. Everyone likes to talk about how much of a joke it was, or travesty it was, or how carny it was, or terrible it was. Sunday was canceled. And no one told anyone Sunday was canceled. People showed up Sunday and the doors were closed with a sign on it saying they were canceled. But we had an awesome time. Just 6 of us together, traveling on the road, going to wrestling, seeing wrestling matches, meeting some of our favorite wrestlers. And making the best of the entire weekend.
Yeah, of course you had a great time. All the wrestlers showed up. There was so many fun matches, including me versus Chris Hero, and a live Art of Wrestling podcast that I did in which Mo from Men on a Mission maybe stole the show because he was just roaming around there all week. I remember I podcasted with Kevin Sullivan that weekend. I also podcasted with Headbanger Mosh that weekend too. But for the wrestlers, now maybe not necessarily the greatest thing. I eventually did get paid from that and also had a great time. But I don't know if I could speak for some of the other wrestlers. And then also what happens is some of the lower card wrestlers, that's where the lower card wrestlers kind of get screwed because they want to make sure that the upper echelon wrestlers get paid and then they don't really care about anybody else. I'm speaking about promoters. But I don't envy promoters at all. That's why I never wanted to be a promoter. I'll stick to promoting a podcast. It's so much to take on. It's just too much. Their heart was in the right place. They wanted to bring professional wrestling all weekend long to Boston, but it also takes fans, paying customers to come to the show. You were one of them. We're so grateful that you were, and thank you. This call is also a reminder that people go to those things. We hear stories and legends of shows. I remember there was a Cow Palace debacle in 2007. Of course, on my Patreon, there was a call about someone at the Vic Grimes New Jack match. And this caller here at the Boston Wrestling Marathon, able to tell the story, able to tell your experience. And for you, of course, you came, you took part, you enjoyed. But I'm going to guess for probably the ring announcer and the referees and the people that put up the ring, they probably didn't enjoy it as much. You like how I'll always take the side of the wrestler? Of course, I'm loyal to the wrestler. But I get where you're coming from, wrestling fan.
In August 2004, I went to a Christian wrestling show. That's a real thing. Put on by Ted DiBiase at a Baptist church in Georgia. Buff Bagwell was there, AJ Styles, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. And as a part of the show, the wrestlers get in the ring and share their testimony about how they became Christian. And when it was Buff's turn, the first thing he said is, "I'll be honest with you guys, I'm really drunk right now." So the whole church, the whole gymnasium at the church, just super awkward at that moment. And then he just rambles on about why he drank that day, because his brother, seen his brother for the first time, whatever. And then at that moment, Brutus the Barber Beefcake walks out of the curtain and screams, "Where is my goddamn ride?" Clearly, the greatest Christian wrestling show ever.
Jesus fucking Christ, am I right? Unbelievable. I don't want to say there's an elephant in the room, but was he calling in about the Christian wrestling show while there was Christmas chimes going on in the background? Don't think I don't have an ear for that, and was very aware of it. I remember when those shows were going on. That was a big thing that Ted DiBiase was doing, and I'm not going to say whether it was or was not a new way for him to make income and maybe take advantage of a situation. Again, it's not for me to say, but there was a time period where this was a big thing. Russo was involved, Ted DiBiase was involved, everybody was finding the Lord and then also doing a sermon and then also putting on a wrestling show, all in the name of Jesus Christ. And the old school wrestlers will be the old school wrestlers. The boys will be the boys. That's the term. And these guys are famous wrestlers looking for a payday. But maybe that was the perfect time for Buff Bagwell to claim how bad life was going at the time. It was the perfect place. Let your sins be known. I don't know the lingo. I'm a Jewish kid. I have no clue. Put a wafer in his mouth, right? Is that a thing? My only reference of church is the movie Home Alone. Although I have wrestled at some church shows, which always makes for a fun wrestling outing for me. But this call makes sense, and this is the perfect place to tell that story. It happened. You saw it. Your mind was a little blown. You got to tell someone. I'm here to listen. I will take a Christian wrestling show story with Brutus Beefcake and Buff Bagwell swearing up a storm any day of the week.
It was 1998, and WCW was coming to the Lehigh Valley for one of its first stops, and Ric Flair flew into the ABE airport, which, Colt, I know you have flown into. It's a tiny little airport now in town. And he was looking to work out before his event, and he stopped at an LA Fitness, and he just tried to walk in and bypass the counter, and he was stopped, and they said, "Excuse me, sir, come back. You have to sign in." And he turned to my friend's mom and said, "I'm Ric Flair." And my friend's mom turned back and said, "Does Ric Flair have a membership?" So from now on, my friends and I have been asking each other if we have memberships. And it shows you what kind of star power some of the wrestlers thought they may have had in the 80s and 90s. But loving the Confidential podcast, and I miss you from Allentown.
In the 80s and 90s? Well, some of those wrestlers still have that attitude now. Of course, these calls are anonymous and confidential, but this caller in Allentown sure does remind me of my good friend Ian Riccaboni. Sounded a lot like him, too. Ian Riccaboni is the voice of Ring of Honor and also hosts a podcast with Carrie Silkin called Last Stop from Penn Station. Carrie Silkin, the former owner of Ring of Honor, has stories and stories and stories to tell, and he is telling them on the Last Stop from Penn Station podcast. Subscribe and listen where you listen to podcasts. I may or may not have told Carrie about this show, so feel free to badger him a little bit about sending in a story. Anonymously, of course. You know who's not anonymous? Ric Flair. He wants the world to know exactly who he is, and that is a situation that makes me happy. When someone who thinks they are a star of stars gets completely checked and brought back to earth a little bit. And you know I'm more than happy when Ric Flair gets put in check a little bit. Does Ric Flair have a membership? I wonder if Ric Flair has the $30,000 that he owes Carrie Silkin. Wow, this all came full circle, didn't it? Well, anonymous caller from Allentown, I love those kind of stories that will always become an inside joke for the rest of your life that you and your friends can tell. And I'm glad that it's at the expense of the Nature Boy.
My father working for a private security company out of Kennedy Airport. One day he comes home and he says, "I work with one of those guys you see on wrestling." I was like, "What are you talking about?" I'm maybe 8 or 9 years old at the time. He's like, "Yeah, one of the Demolition guys." And I was like, "No way. You work with Axe, Smash, or Crush?" He's like, "Yeah, I work with one of those guys." And he kept on telling me about him. Kept on saying he worked with the Demolition guy. And then finally, he's like, "Yeah, they're doing a wrestling show at a high school on Long Island." Me, my father, my uncle, and my cousin all go to a high school gym on the North Shore of Long Island, where we see that Demolition is advertised to take on Greg the Hammer Valentine and Jimmy Snuka, and I am delighted. Greg the Hammer Valentine and Snuka come out to the ring in the main event. Then they introduce Demolition, and out comes Axe, who I recognize, and then my dad's like, "There's Carmine." And I'm like, "Who the hell is Carmine?" He said, "Carmine's the other guy in Demolition." And turned out to be some guy named Blast, who was like the dollar store version of Smash and Crush put together. Not what I was expecting at all.
Carmine is not the other member of Demolition. Even the 8-year-old knows that. There's Carmine. Is it Brian? Is it Barry? No, it's Carmine. You couldn't be too upset, now could you? You got Greg Valentine and Jimmy Snuka and Demolition Axe. 3 out of 4 is not bad. Crush had to be Crush, Barry Darso had to be the Repo Man, and Demolition Axe was in a lawsuit with Vince McMahon, so he wasn't going back to the Fed, so he needed another Demolition, and it had to be somebody. And in a small, small world, it was a buddy of your father's who worked at the Kennedy Airport, whose name was Carmine, and he wrestled on the Independence on the weekend. I enjoy your disappointment, but I feel there were some true wrestling stars at that show, and you should have been a little more excited. You know Greg Valentine had a banger that night, flying around, doing figure fours, Snuka, charging the promoter an extra $250 to jump off the top rope. Please, you got enough. I'm sorry Carmine was there to fill in for Smash, but the star power was there, and I'm sure for an 8 or 9-year-old, it was a wonderful show. Support the independents, even the one that have the bootleg wrestlers on it.
I grew up on what you Americans would call an Indian reservation in northern Manitoba. And when I was growing up, my res was the last stop for gas before basically the road stopped. And so people would often stop at the gas station in my hometown. One day I was there and there was this huge van we were waiting for gas. My dad was talking to these guys in the van. And back then I hadn't really met very many white guys or very many white people. So imagine how terrified I was to be the 6-year-old little native girl seeing this huge guy with like piercing blue eyes who was even taller than my dad. My dad had been talking to these guys for a while before I showed up. And he tells them, like, hey, my little girl wants to grow up to be a wrestler. And he looks at me and he says, these guys are wrestlers. And the big scary guy with the blue eyes looks at me and says hi. And he crouches down and to my eye level and like coaxes me out from behind my dad. And he asks me my name, and I have my hand in my mouth, so I mumble it. And then I tell him again when I take my hand out of my mouth. And he asked me who my favorite wrestler was. And I said, Bret Hart. And he asked me, so you want to be a wrestler? And I nod, and I'm like, yeah, I do, but I can't. And he says, why? And I tell him, because girls can't be wrestlers. He's sad for a second, and then he says, well, what about Luna Vachon? And I had never heard anyone put respect on Luna Vachon's name when I was a kid. So I asked this guy, who ended up being called Adam, if he could teach me how to do a hurricanrana. And it was only later, like, when I saw Adam on TV wrestling as Edge, though I didn't end up becoming a wrestler, I'm still involved in the community, and I am filming a documentary on pro wrestling and the exact tour that brought Adam Edge to the north of my province. And I hope that, like, he realizes how important that, like, 5 minutes where he talked to a little 6-year-old nerd in the parking lot of a gas station in northern Manitoba, how much that 5 minutes meant to me, because he was the first dude outside of my grandfather and my dad who thought I could grow up to be anything I wanted.
Oh, I like this call for so many different reasons. First of all, do all Canadians love Bret Hart? Is that just how that works? Was Bret Hart really every single Canadian's favorite wrestler? I guess if you're a little 6-year-old girl who likes wrestling, of course he's going to be. But the main reason is, as I sit here in my apartment in Chicago, Illinois, a big bustling city, I realize that I'm in this metropolitan area. There's a lot going on. There's so much wrestling happening here all the time. But there's other people listening to this show from all over the world. And I have wrestled on these small reservations in Canada. And it gives you a second to think about how, because of the internet, we are all connected. Back in that time, when those guys were doing those death tours, there was no internet. And if there was, it was not accessible. So it's just like you go to a show, you hope that the local promoter put up some posters, you do the show and you go on to the next town, and there's no other way to get connected to the wrestling fans. It's just wait until they come the next time. But now this woman who's on a reservation, a native lady, can call in and tell her story of being so far away at the time, but now being so close, because we can all be so close because of wrestling and because of the internet. And I'm glad you were able to stay close to wrestling and stay true to your heart. And what a fun story, too, just proving how great of a guy that Adam/Edge is. And it's always fun to hear those stories of before they were stars. And I bet it'd be pretty wild to be so young and to see this guy who's doing these small little tours, and then a year or 2 years later is on national television and becomes this huge megastar. I think that's the fun part of wrestling. It's the fun part of the independence. And it's the fun part of the scene just in general. Thank you for your call, and I appreciate the diversity, really, that it brings to the show.
It's the early 90s in the west suburbs of Chicago. I'm about 3 or 4 years old watching primetime wrestling with my older brother, and we are enthralled by everything about the world of wrestling, right down to the man in the dapper tuxedo interviewing wrestlers. For younger fans who don't know Mean Gene Okerlund, at this time in his career, the hair on the top of his head had migrated down to his upper lip to form this glorious mustache. And on our floor model TV, I gotta say, he looked pretty tan. So I would look at Mean Gene with his tan skin and his mustache, and I would look at my Puerto Rican grandpa and the guys he hung out with, who also had tan skin and mustaches. It comes to this conclusion. Of course, Mean Gene Okerlund was related to us, which meant that he was an uncle. And if he is an uncle, then it follows that it is every Puerto Rican uncle's duty to come over and have a beer with my grandpa. And if he's having a beer with my grandpa, then logically, my brother and I have to come say hi, because that's how we were raised. And if we're there saying hi, then he will know that we watch wrestling, and he will tell us stories about all of the wrestlers he's interviewed while we sit at his feet and listen quietly. And eventually, life happened. My grandpa passed away. The beer-drinking tan mustache men didn't come around as much. We moved away, and eventually I figured out that this just wasn't going to happen for me. Until the 2000s, back in the days of message boards, when I told the story to my new friend Matt, who also liked wrestling. He sent me something on Skype, and what he sent me was a video message that he had purchased in the days before Cameo, directly from Mean Gene Okerlund, in which Mean Gene said my full name, wished me a happy birthday, and reminded me of this ridiculous story from my childhood.
First of all, in the days before pro wrestling shoots at prowrestlingtees.com, not cameos. Let's get that straight. Pro wrestling shoots, prowrestlingtees.com. I love the story. I love the storytelling. A little bit of me wish that Mean Gene would have said in his video that he was your uncle, but we can't have everything, now can we? And that is fun to think. If you're a little Puerto Rican girl, that Mean Gene was so tan that you thought he was a Puerto Rican man, which makes all the sense in the world. Of course it does. What I loved more was the logic that I guess your world was so small that even though he was on national global television, all the tan mustached Puerto Rican men, they all come over, they all drink with Grandpa, so he'll be over at any moment. Ah, to be young and a little clueless. It's fun though, right? The best though, Mean Gene thinking he's Puerto Rican. So good.
So in the early days of TNA, like the early 2000s, I lived about 45 minutes outside of Nashville. So my buddies and I would go down on Wednesday nights pretty regularly, and we would see Jeremy Borash giving out backstage passes to the rowdiest fans, the craziest fans. We decided one week this was our week. We were going to win this no matter what it took. So we dressed ridiculously and acted crazy. Of course, you know, we were wearing cowboy hats, and my best friend was wearing his luchador mask, which he used to wear at parties. And, of course, everyone referred to him as Quasar, the luchador. And, of course, that night we got picked. So we got to go backstage, which wasn't really backstage. It was kind of behind a railing, and they started to bring out stars for us to meet. They brought AJ Styles, Ron the Truth Killing, and then they brought out D'Lo Brown. We couldn't help but notice after we won this exclusive prize that there were other fans coming up to the rail, and some of them were getting autographs too, including one little boy who was about 6 or 7. And I saw him take this T-shirt around to AJ and to Ron the Truth, and then to D'Lo, and then he came back around, handed us the T-shirt as if to say, give it to D'Lo to sign. When we did that, D'Lo looked at it. He said, I've already signed this. And the kid looked up again at my friend wearing the luchador mask, and I realized this kid wants my friend to sign the shirt. So I said, you sign it, Quasar. D'Lo chimes in, yeah, you sign it, Quasar. So without asking this kid his name or anything else about it, my friend takes his T-shirt, signs, Dear Johnny, get well soon. Love, Quasar.
Oh, Little Johnny. Definitely not his name. But they're all Little Johnnies to Quasar, right? It was the matter of D'Lo Brown not giving a fuck that I think made the call fun for me. He was in on the rib. That's what we do. We're trying to entertain ourselves. And D'Lo Brown is such a good dude that he's very humble, puts himself in check, doesn't think he's a bigger star than anybody else, that he's more than happy to play along with that. Very quick-witted, too. And you have to be. When you've been on the road as long as he has, you have to do things to entertain yourself and have fun. And obviously, that's exactly what these guys did, too. Quasar, huge wrestling star, which I assume is what he wanted in the first place. When you're a wrestling fan and you try to bring attention to yourself, essentially all you're saying is, I want to be part of the show. I basically want to be a star. I want to sign autographs. And he got exactly probably what he wanted. And total side note, I am doing a convention next week where me, Virgil, and Quasar will all be signing $20, $30 combo. See you there, Quasar.
I felt for a long time that in some ways pro wrestling saved my life. I was never a fan of pro wrestling. I didn't start watching pro wrestling until I think 2009. At that point, I was 33, 34 years old. I was going through a lot of really difficult times in my personal life, and somehow, while kind of scrolling through the channels or flicking through the channels at that time, I landed on an episode of Monday Night Raw. It just kind of drew me in. I started watching, and as things in my life continued to spiral downward, I started paying more and more attention to pro wrestling. And I got online and I found not only Ring of Honor, but I found PWG, and I just found the indies, and I started using drugs and kind of lost everything that was important to me. And the only thing that kind of kept me connected to the rest of the world was pro wrestling. And I slowly got myself back together, rebuilt my life. I'm doing great and have been for several years. I'm a chemical dependency counselor now. I have 2 kids. Part of it's because I'm a pro wrestling fan, and because I had this one thing that kept me connected. It got me back into interacting with people in the rest of the world. I started going to shows. So to this day, not only am I a huge fan, but I feel extremely loyal to professional wrestling for what it did for me, especially during some of the darkest times in my life.
Yeah, I know how important wrestling is to me. I know how important wrestling is probably to everybody listening to this. And it's important to different reasons for everybody. So to hear a story like this, where she's losing everything, and maybe it's not something that I can necessarily relate to in terms of drugs and misuse of drugs, but I do know that wrestling has been there for me in some dark times, even when wrestling was the reason for dark times, which is pretty crazy to admit or even hear myself say, but I can kind of separate the wrestling into different categories. And that's the theme of the show. That's the theme of everything, is that wrestling is here for us. It's a constant in our lives. And I'm so glad that this is something that you hung on to bring you upwards and onwards and move forward in such a great and positive way. I'm so happy that you found your way. You're continuing to find your way. I know it's work and it's hard every single day, but I'm grateful that me and the rest of my job and the community and everything, we can all be there for you, because I'm sure it's a struggle. I know it's a struggle, but I don't think this thing's going away. So we'll be here for a while. Hey, thanks for watching. That call was part of a whole podcast called Wrestling Anonymous. Listen to the whole thing weekly. Wherever you listen to your podcast, go subscribe. And while you're at it, subscribe right here on YouTube to Colt Cabana's channel. Thank you.